You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Greetings, everyone. Coach Jen here, and thanks for tuning in to Horse Tip Daily, episode 1563. Today, Dr. Tania Cubitt joins us to dispel some myths about protein in our horse's diet. And we'll get right to it after we have a word from our sponsor, Equestrian Plus.
Recharge your training program with Equestrian Plus. Equestrian Plus brings together top riders, trainers, and professionals onto one video platform. Watch over 5,000 how-to training videos, clinic and event footage, exclusive training sessions, and more featuring top experts including 5-time dressage Olympian Stefan Peters, 5-time Olympic show jumper Ann Krasinski, Olympic eventer and silver medalist William Fox Pitt, and more. Join Equestrian Plus now and use promo code HRN15 for 15% off your first month. Visit EquestrianPlusPLUS.com to subscribe.
Well, we're thrilled that you're taking a little time out of your day to answer some questions for us today. And today it's all about proteins. What the heck are they, and why do I care?
Proteins, and I'm so glad we're talking about this topic because protein is so very important, and it really gets a bad rap. There are a lot of myths about protein out there, so I want to dispel a couple of those as well as just talk about what on earth is protein. So what is it? It makes up about 15% of our body, with most in the muscle. It has key functions including transporting nutrients in the bloodstream, metabolic functions, helps as a part of your immune system, also helps to minimize and buffer pH levels. And it's made up of small units called amino acids. And lysine, which most of listeners have probably heard of, is often the most lacking in our equine diets. And it's also the only one we actually have a true requirement for. And we call lysine an essential nutrient. And when we use that term correctly in equine nutrition, it means that the horse can't make it or synthesize it in its body. It has to consume it in its diet. So it really has to eat feed sources that are very high in those quality amino acids like lysine. And those ingredients would be things like soybean meal, which is a legume, or alfalfa, which is also a legume.
Interesting. Now, this is where the conversations frequently take a left-hand turn. So if you are a feral horse, you're a Mustang wandering around the wilds of Montana, they obviously are not given any food that would contain extra lysine. How does he survive? Because he's got to get it somewhere. Are there naturally occurring food sources that have sufficient quantities so that an animal can subsist? Is that kind of how it works?
Absolutely. I mean, there are weeds that are also legumes out in the wild. You've also got to think, because I commonly get this question, well, horses in the wild did fine without that and without us. They also probably have a life expectancy between, let's say, 7 to 12 years.
Good point. Yeah.
We're expecting our horses to live 30 years, and they reproduce. They only run away from predators. They don't have to jump and exercise, and they have a wide variety of different forages, shrubs, weeds, grasses in the wild that they can chew on. So, and our domesticated horses typically in a lot of places aren't getting a lot of access to pasture. If they are, maybe it's not very green pasture. Or anyway, horses in the wild, lots of access to different types of forages.
And a very different lifestyle. So
exactly.
we can't compare domesticated horses and wild horses and expect them to have the same requirements for that essential amino acid. So
You're exactly right.
They need it, and they're not all built the same. Okay, So I've got that part.
When it comes to looking at how much, looking at how much a horse needs, everybody is aware that a young growing horse needs a lot more protein for growth, because really what you're doing as a young animal or a young human is you're laying down tissue, laying down muscle, and that, as I just mentioned, is primarily protein. So quality protein is absolutely critical for a young growing animal. Despite one of the myths you may have heard that high protein diets cause developmental orthopedic disease or problems with joints in foals. That is an absolute myth. And it was a study done back in the 1970s in Great Dane dogs, actually, that implicated excess protein in causing these growth disorders. But subsequent studies have revealed there's no relationship between high protein diets and growth disorders, and both protein and energy are absolutely critical for proper growth and bone maturation. And other studies have shown that bone turnover is depressed in horses that aren't fed a adequate protein diet, so a low protein diet. So the old recommendation, if your horse has growth problems, to take all the feed away and it's protein that's causing it, is really incorrect. And we absolutely, whilst we may take away some of the energy because we don't want these horses overweight, we absolutely need to make sure we're giving them quality protein sources to help support the growth, along with adequate vitamins and minerals to help support the growth.
So if feeding quote high protein diet to a young horse is not directly going to cause an orthopedic disease, can withholding protein, in other words, feeding a young growing horse dramatically insufficient amounts of protein, can that cause growth problems?
We haven't done the studies to directly say if you withhold protein, you will cause developmental orthopedic disease. But we have done enough studies to show that not feeding adequate amounts of quality protein is detrimental to bone strength and growth. So while it's not directly related to an actual disorder, the whole goal of breeding and growing young foals is strong, healthy bones, because they have to, throughout the rest of their 30 years, put up with the rigors of maybe it's a racehorse and then it's going to be a show hunter and then it's going to work in a riding program. So it's got to be working a lot of its life, and we really need to make sure we're developing really strong bones.
Do we have any data yet at this point? I don't know if anybody's ever taken the time to study it, whether or not a young horse who has been deprived of those nutrients for an extended period of time, for example, someone who adopts a 4 or 5 year old horse that was a starvation case when it was a baby. Do we know if there are long-term effects on the horse's skeletal system, specifically their skeletal system, because of that, or hasn't anybody had the ability to study that yet?
You know, long-term studies in horses are always difficult because they're very expensive, but that is certainly something that I would say quite possible. We know that in young horses, especially actually go further to even before they're born, in utero, that if mares malnourished or starved during pregnancy, that we definitely have issues with the growth of the young horse or the development of the young horse. We know that about people. So certainly you could make that assumption that a malnourished young horse, as it goes through its life, is just going to have more issues overall.
Yeah, just more likely to have issues. Well, that's one of those things that it kind of makes common sense. Yeah. So we've got different kinds of proteins that are not all created equal. We need to feed appropriate amounts to young horses. Okay, what else have we got going here with this protein thing?
Well, and I just want to throw out there, because we've got some products on the market, commercial products, that have certain percentages of protein. Everybody looks at their commercial horse feed, and
they've even taken the naming of the feed that way now.
I know. I ask people.
Yeah, horse feed number 12. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, and I ask people, what are you feeding your horse? And they say, well, I'm feeding a 12% textured feed or a 14% sweet feed. Really, percentages don't mean anything unless they're associated with an amount. Same goes for if we're looking at sugars and starches in the diet, or even potassium if you've got one of those quarter horses suffering from HYPP. Other topics for other days.
Yes.
But my point being, percentages alone really mean nothing. So let's take, for example, we've got feeds on the market that I will call generically a low intake ration balancer. They're very concentrated. They're designed to be fed at 1 pound a day to a 1,000-pound horse. And typically the protein contents are very high, maybe 25 to 30% protein. And that freaks people out. Oh my gosh, that's way too much protein. I couldn't feed my horse that. And I say, well, what protein content are you comfortable feeding your horse? Oh, probably about 12%. And I say, well, how much are you feeding of that 12% protein feed? Well, he gets about 4 pounds a day, 4 pounds a day. So I then break down the math for people and I show them, okay, if we have a feed that's 25% protein, but you only have to feed 1 pound a day of it, the amount of actual protein your horse gets out of that is 4 ounces. 12% protein feed that you feed 4 pounds a day, your horse is actually getting about 7.7, let's say, 8 ounces of protein a day. So in the lower percentage, based on the feeding rate of being 4 pounds, you're getting double the amount of protein. So when I break it down for people like that, oh, okay. And then you've also got to think, even the poorest, low quality hay, grass hays, are going to run around 8% protein. So if we have to feed our horse about 15 pounds of grass hay a day at 8% protein, that's close to 20 ounces of protein.
Wow.
So we really have to put it in perspective of how much am I actually feeding, and just go back to doing some basic math, and it all will become a lot clearer to us.
See, that's where the problem is. There are too many horse people who are bad at math.
Just to put those values that I was giving you, the 4, 8, and close to 20 ounces, put that in perspective of what a 1,000-pound horse needs. Let's go back to the 1,000-pound. Actually, how much protein do they actually need in a day?
Yeah, anyway.
So for a maintenance horse that's doing nothing, just an average maintenance horse, he needs about 22 ounces of protein a day.
Really?
So typically, we can get that from a decent quality hay. But then if we looked at a horse doing heavy work, say a racehorse, they're going to need about 35 ounces a day of protein.
Wow.
And lactation, early lactation, which is no surprise, early lactation, because that mare is putting so much of those proteins, amino acids into making milk, good quality milk. Lactation, early lactation, the horse is going to need about 54 ounces of protein a day.
Wow.
So it's really, really critical.
That's a lot. So it's going to matter what kind of hay they're getting. Because
Absolutely.
different hays have lots of different levels of protein in them. Now, somewhere I read, it was probably on a blog, and this is something that's been floating around for many, many years. You hear folks say, I can't give my horse alfalfa hay, in other words, high protein hay, because it makes him high. Do we have any actual research that says that protein in excess makes a horse, quote, hot or high?
Well, let's just go back to when proteins digested. So when you eat food, you digest protein and it gets absorbed and then goes into your bloodstream. In order for it to be ever used as energy, it actually takes energy to turn it into energy. So it's kind of energy neutral. The one time that an animal would use protein as its primary energy source is if the animal was starving. And you've used up all of your fat stores, you've used up all of the glucose that's stored in your muscle, and now you're starting to break down your own tissues in a catabolic state, to break down your own tissues to try and stay alive. So that's when you'd use protein as your primary energy source. Protein is really not a great energy source. So alfalfa gets a bad rap for making horses high, but really any high protein feeds, horses are very good at excreting excess protein. And if you feed your horse alfalfa and he does get a little hot, it's really nothing to do with the protein and more to do with the fact that alfalfa is much higher in energy than most of your grass hays. And if you're not exercising your horse enough, then extra energy can be displayed in hyper behaviors.
He's just going, woohoo!
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
got it.
So high protein feeds will not make your horse crazy. High energy feeds, if you're not exercising them enough, will. So this is where I get the funny question, people will say, well, and we're kind of going off protein a little. I want to put weight on my horse, but I don't want him to get any fat. I don't want him to get hot or crazy. Well, that's when you have to really look at the type of energy you're feeding, sugars and starches versus oil. But a lot of extra energy, it doesn't matter whether they're laying it down as fat. If they don't need it, if they're not exercising, they may get hot.
Well, there you go. Now, you said that horses are good at excreting excess protein. Where does it go?
Out in the urine. So the kidneys filter out excess protein, and it'll go out in the urine. So I think there is some information or some myths floating around, and this one is actually true. If you do have your horse on a very high protein diet, you have to make sure they're drinking lots and lots of water. You may actually smell more ammonia in the urine in those horses. That's not a bad thing unless the barn isn't ventilated, because that's just the horse excreting excess. If you're smelling a lot of ammonia, it may mean that you're feeding too much protein and you don't really need that much, because you can tell the horse is excreting excess.
So from the purely practical point of view, if you have horses who are excreting the excess proteins, stall reeks of ammonia, and you have to spend lots and lots of extra money on stall freshener, would it not make sense that you are throwing some of your feeding dollars away because higher protein feedstuffs cost more than lower protein feedstuffs?
They do. And you may, and typically it's going to, as you noted before, even with my 8% protein hay, I'm still getting 20 ounces of protein out of it. You really want to look at your hay first. And a lot of times we will feed alfalfa if we need weight gain, but sometimes cutting that alfalfa 50-50 with some grass hay will help to level out that ammonia content. And then adding weight from other things like fat supplements.
Yeah. So my next question is, you buy a bag of horse feed, and right there on the front of the bag of horse feed in great big gold letters, 12% protein. It's like, well, that sounds reasonable for my pleasure horse. And it cost you $13.85. And then you walk down the aisleway a little bit further, and right there's a bag of horse feed in great big, beautiful green letters over top of a picture of a reining horse. 12% protein. And that bag is going to cost me $25. What is going on here?
So we're saying both feeds had the same protein content, right?
They both say 12% protein on the front. Why is one $12 and one's $25?
Because I can make protein, and this is another reason why I really don't like just looking at the percentage, because that crude protein percentage value doesn't tell me anything about the quality of the protein source. I could grind up chicken feathers and, some dog food, and I could probably make you a 12% protein feed, but it is not what you would want to feed your horses. Quality protein sources that are high in those amino acids, like your legumes or seed meals, they're going to be a little bit more expensive, hence the one that was $25 a bag. Really, when we have feeds that are, I guarantee also, if you looked at the feeding rate of the more expensive bag, you can probably feed less of it. So again, one of the other tricks to working out, is this feed cost effective for me? Don't just look at the price of the bag, but look at how much do I have to feed? So what is the cost per head per day? So if I've got, let's go back to the feed where it was 25% protein, they come in 50-pound bags, and I only have to feed 1 pound a day. That'll last one horse 50 days. And it works out usually, and I've seen pricing across the board, anywhere between 50 and 60 cents a day to feed a horse, versus your 12% protein feed that may be significantly less expensive for the cost of the bag. But if you've got to feed 4 pounds a day of it, that's going to last you nowhere near as long. It's going to last you, 12 days versus 50 days. So if you've got exactly the same protein content, price difference is going to come with quality of ingredients, as well as other technologies that companies are putting in feed, like are they adding probiotics? What sources of fiber are they adding in it? Mm-hmm. Does it have a lot of byproducts in there, or is it
right? It's one of those things you have to read the tiny print.
You do. And I think a great topic for one of our talks should be going through a tag and so going from beginning to the end of the ingredients list, and what is it all? Because that's a common question I get. What is this? What is this? How do I read my tag?
Yeah. So, one more question about proteins.
Absolutely.
So it's easy enough to overfeed protein. Your horse is getting more ounces of protein than he needs.
Mm-hmm.
If I am feeding one horse the appropriate ounces of protein he needs each day,
mm-hmm.
which is, what did you say, 8 ounces? Does it matter if it's 8 ounces of high quality protein or 8 ounces of crappy protein? Does that matter in the long run?
It does. And if you are in any other livestock industry, pigs, cattle, chickens, they don't actually look at crude protein values anymore. They're quite archaic. They will actually look at individual amino acid requirements. So a growing pig needs X amount of lysine and X amount of methionine. And as I mentioned, we do have requirements for lysine in the horse. So especially in the young growing horse, it's really critical that you don't just feed them, say, a 14% protein feed, but you're also looking at the lysine content of the product.
So this is complicated stuff, Dr. Cubitt.
It does get very complicated. It really does. And so people really have to rely on the fact that nutritionists do design the products that you buy, and the feeding rates on the backs of the bags are there for a reason. And if you feed according to those feeding rates, then we can guarantee you that guaranteed analysis. I can guarantee your horse is getting the correct amount of each of those nutrients. If you can't feed that amount, that's okay. If your horse is going to get too fat, if you feed 4 pounds of a feed, then you need to just find a feed where you can feed the appropriate amount. Other things that you may see in a mature horse, if they really don't have enough protein or quality protein, definitely poor hoof and hair quality, poor coat quality. Methionine, one of those essential amino acids, is really critical for hoof quality and hair quality, considering hoof is just hard hair. Just generally not doing well. So protein is really, really important.
And that's where you see the chubby pasture pet with a really lousy coat. And poor
exactly.
feet.
And we know in humans that just because of a certain weight doesn't mean that you're well nourished. You can be obese and still malnourished.
Well, that was fascinating stuff. You made my head spin, Dr. Cubitt, and I appreciate that.
Take-home message, protein's not the enemy. It's very important.
Well, there you have it. Horse Radio Network has thousands of engaging podcasts for horse people, and you can have them sent right to your phone. Just subscribe via your favorite podcast player. This is Coach Jen, and I will be back again soon with another tip. Until then, go ride your horse. The Horse Radio Network and the Horse Radio Network hosts are not responsible for statements made by guests on the Horse Tip Daily. Please use your own judgment when listening to the tips on this show.